Good evening, everyone. You'll just have to give us a minute or two because Tom Campbell is having a bit of a problem with his link. In this tech age, there are always technical glitches. So just give us a few minutes and we'll come on in as soon as he's online.
Hello.
Hello there, Tom, and welcome.
Kamini, good morning.
Good morning. Okay, so let's jump right in. I'm delighted to be in conversation with Thomas Campbell, who's just popped up on our screens after a tech glitch and who has led two of America's major museums and is currently the director and CEO of one of them, the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, that comprises two institutions, the de Young, with its beautiful setting in Golden Gate Park, and the Legion of Honor at Lincoln Park. Two spaces that present different experiences. De Young foregrounds a fine collection of American art, as well as art from the Oceanic and African regions, while the Legion of Honor houses mainly European art and antiquities. Tom Campbell took over at FAMSF 4 years ago and very quickly set about introducing initiatives to energize the local community and empower his curators to draw on their roots in the Bay Area. All of this not surprising if you think about what he did before that with audiences at the Met that he headed for 8 years. In many ways, Tom re-visualized the way the Met would engage with its visitors through new initiatives, programming, and exhibitions that saw audience figures explode by 50% to a record 7 million a year. I hope we will be able to explore some of this in the next hour, so let's begin. But just before that, for those of you who are interested, we have a more detailed bio in the chat box that you can look up. There will also be time for a few questions at the end, so just type them in on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. And thank you to us two sign language interpreters, Saurabh and Ria. So welcome, Tom, and a pleasure to have you with us today.
Good morning, or good evening rather, and it's great to be with you. And after that little panicked tech glitch, I don't know what was going on, but I guess that's the challenge we continue to live with in the modern era.
Absolutely. And so let's begin with that tech discussion. I thought we'd begin the conversation around museums in the digital space, because that's where many of us were forced to migrate during the pandemic. And we are now much more aware of what a powerful tool it can be for museums when it works. Yeah. You, Tom, were almost prescient in the way you made a great push for going digital at the Met way before all this happened. So what are you seeing as the likely way forward, and how do we achieve that harmony between the physical space of the museum and the virtual world?
Well, I know where we've come from. I'm not sure how prescient I am about where we're going, because we are in an era of such rapid change. I remember when I was starting out my career as a curator.
Mm-hmm.
And, we all wanted to be published in analog publications, the Burlington and the Apollo. And we were cynical about online publications. But around 2000, I think we all suddenly realized the larger audience we could reach. And so both as a curator and then as a director at the Met, I was involved in a very major investment in getting collections online and generating content. And of course, that's now become the norm. Every museum has its website, every museum is getting its collection online and engaging with audiences online. And thanks to that investment over the last 20-25 years, the COVID pandemic and the closure was a very different event for all of cultural institutions than it would have been 20 years ago, because we were able to carry on a very considerable part of our research, of our audience engagement. So that's all wonderful. And I think that, we're only going to see more richer websites, more cross connections, more ways of connecting with that information when we're on site. So I think that we're still, very much in this period of massive investment. At the same time, we're still in the business of objects. You, Map, you've been an online museum, but you're about to have your grand opening, which is very exciting in December. And that it is ultimately, it's about bringing people to the objects, as well as having this digital exploration. So I think the two live together, and will continue to live together.
Well, let me pursue this a little further. Has the net as an information freeway also required us to reframe the relationship with our audiences, where the museum can no longer be the dominant voice it once was? The world online has really democratized access to information and learning to some extent. And yes, it is a double-edged sword, because you have inaccurate information that comes with its own biases or is channelized to reinforce our own prejudices. But with all its downsides, the net has made knowledge sharing more widespread than it has ever been before. Is it important for us as museums to rework this relationship with our audiences?
Well, certainly the democratization of information online, in a way, it knocks the sort of the priest-like status that curators had as the arbiters of knowledge that was hard won. It has been removed, because now everybody can go online and find out a huge amount of information. Of course, a lot of the information online is inaccurate or misleading. So there's still very much a role for curators and museum professionals to bring their experience as editors to the narrative. But I think we are, that concept of democratization is critical because of the sort of rethinking we're going through at this moment. The narrative of museums has been so much established over the last century or more by a Eurocentric colonial point of view. Many of the great museums in Europe and America were built on collections that resulted from colonial appropriation or expropriation or outright looting, and then over the decades, the narrative that many of those museums have told has been heavily inflected by the privilege of a European and a colonial American elite at the expense of audiences and voices that were not being included. And we're clearly now going through a shift in that, that we're all working to step back and tell a broader narrative, a more objective narrative about history. And I think that the digital realm is helping drive that.
Agreed, because today we're really looking at how museums can be accessible spaces for visitors. And as a new museum, we are really working hard to see how we can make everybody feel welcome at MAP. And you have introduced several initiatives to connect with diverse audiences as we witness a very heated debate today on, who museums are for and what are the narratives they convey, which was what you were just mentioning. So do you want to develop that a little more and tell us what you are doing at FAMSF?
Sure, of course. So I joined the Fine Art Museums in San Francisco just over 4 years ago. And when I arrived, one of the things I think I realized quite early on is that the museums are city museums, but we didn't have as strong a link with the citizens of the city as we might have done. So we've undertaken a number of initiatives to really try and expand our engagement with the local community. And I think we might have some slides here. One of the initiatives we took is to introduce a free Saturday program. This is funded by our chair emerita, Mrs. Wilsey, and it basically allows us to give free admission to residents of the Bay Area every Saturday. And it's been a huge success.
Thank you.
We've expanded our reach into more diverse communities. We've removed a socio-economic barrier to entry. And since this program started, we've had something like 300,000 people who've come to the museum through this program for free. And the numbers are just growing every Saturday. So that's been one initiative that I think is a long-term investment in building relations. Another aspect of the work we've been doing to engage with the community is really trying to reach out and build relationships with the artists in the Bay Area. And a great example of this was during COVID, trying to figure out what we might do to help the local artist community. We organized what we called the De Young Open. It was an open invitational exhibition, and we thought we might get a few hundred entries. And in the event, we actually got 11,000 entries from more than 6,000 artists.
Wow.
And we selected we had a committee of curators and local artists, and we selected about 750 works, and we hung them thematically. Some were figurative, some were political, some were landscape, some were abstract, and we hung them, as you see in this image, corner to corner, floor to ceiling, Academy style. And it was a wonderful opportunity for us to work with local artists and showcase local artists. Every work was for sale, all the profits went to the artists. And I think it was such a success that we're actually now making this a triennial, and we're going to have the next iteration next fall. Then we've also been doing a lot of work. We're reaching out to schools, and we've something called an equity partnership with 6 schools we're piloting. But we're also very much thinking in terms of families. I mean, here, this is an image of what we called the Youngsters' Day Out, which we had last March. Every year we had a ticketed party for families and young children but by nature, it was a somewhat exclusive event because of the high cost of the tickets.
Mm-hmm.
But what we did in the last iteration, thanks to the support of some trustees, so we had the people who could afford to buy the tickets essentially were supporting an event that was open to everybody. And it was inside the museum and outside the museum in the park around us, taking advantage of the setting. And we had something like 8,000 children and their families and their caregivers making art in the museum and outside the museum. It was a joyous occasion. So those are three examples of steps we've been taking to engage the community.
Lovely. Okay. I want to come to the subject of when we're talking about narratives that we have for the community and for our audiences. Race and racism are also issues that museums have been asked to respond to, especially in America after the George Floyd incident. And while we had a flood of exhibitions and programming on Black artists and themes, there is a sort of deeper problem here, right? Because how much diversity is there actually in the museum world, and how many people of color hold positions of authority in museums? Just over 4% of curators in the US are African American. Is this also part of why the narrative does not change very often?
Well, I think with this question, you come to the core, almost the most important issue that museums and cultural institutions are facing at the moment in America. It's this question of rethinking the narratives that we've been telling. We're curators of objects, but we're also curators of stories. And I think what we've realized, maybe many had been realizing over a period of time, but what we've all come to realize very dramatically in the last 3 years since the murder of George Floyd is how partial the stories that we've been telling are. And I think that as an industry we've been moving towards it over the years. I mean, for example, pre-COVID, pre the murder of George Floyd, we had, like many institutions, we had been buying art from a more diverse spectrum of artists. Some of that art was directly addressing this. I think we have some slides of the work that we bought back in 2019 of it's a wide, this is a section of what is it's a 60-foot wide projection of a work by an artist called Lisa Rihanna, who's part Maori by descent. And she created this film that is projected over about 60 feet, and it slowly moves from right to left. And it's inspired by 19th century wallpapers that showed Captain Cook arriving in the Pacific Islands, and showed him as a hero, and it showed the native inhabitants as it were heroic savages. And you see one of these wallpapers on the right. What Rihanna has done in this work is by looking at reading diaries and doing research into the true circumstances, she brings forward a much more realistic narrative, still quite poetical and metaphorical, about the encounter between Cook and his sailors and the native peoples. So it's this process of beginning to unpack the more complex stories, and we're doing this, with the works of art we're buying, with the labels we're writing about the objects. I think if we go forward, it's not just about race, it's also bringing in women artists who've been excluded. This is here we're seeing an embroidery made designed by Judy Chicago. And it's we did a big Judy Chicago exhibition a couple of years ago. And this is part of a series called the Birthing series, where she created designs that were then woven in tapestries or made as embroideries by women textile makers across the country. And the theme was, the concept was that while Western art is full of images of mothers and children, very often these are religious, iconic images of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child, generated by artists, by Christian artists, there were remarkably few images about motherhood, especially about birth. So this series in metaphorical, somewhat metaphorical, but sometimes abstract form, is a meditation on the miracle, the pain, the complexity of childbirth. So I think that, this is one example of the need for us to bring in artists who've been excluded from the canon. That includes women artists, as well as non-white artists. What do we have next? I think we have another image from the Birthing series, somewhat. Yes, here, this is thinking of this question and not in another respect.
Mm-hmm.
This is a portrait of George Washington by Rembrandt Peale we have in our collection. It's one of over 100 copies of this model that were made after Washington's death. And this was an image that was, helped to make Washington this iconic figure for Americans. For many white Americans, Washington is a hero, the first president. But he was also the president who, started a genocidal conflict against Native Americans that was to drive over the decades Native Americans from their homelands. He was also an enslaver, and at the end of his life regretted that he had not done more to bring slavery to an end. And we recently rewrote the label for this painting, telling more of that narrative. And I've actually had I've had mail from visitors saying, why do you bring that sort of subject matter into a wall label? I go to a museum to relax, to escape. But my response to that is, we're historians, and if we only tell part of the story that is comfortable for our white audience, then we're perpetuating a narrative or narratives that will exclude others. So I'm not saying we've got it perfectly right yet, but I think that this is an ongoing process, that we have to continue to rethink the stories that we're telling.
Yeah, when I was just looking at this whole Birthing series that you'd shown us previously, we are constantly, even at MAP, we are looking at being a platform also for the marginalized voices. And when our opening exhibition really is on the gender issue. And when you spoke of the whole mother and child image that we see across so much of art, both in the West and back home, it's always the mother and the male child. The girl child is almost invisible, which is just such an interesting aspect, right?
Yeah.
It's always the male child. So so
we have another. I think if we put our slides forward a couple of slides, but this is a historically. So many of our collections in the West are the collections of works by male artists, predominantly white male artists. So we're working to try and bring in the contemporary. It's thank goodness it's easy. There are many wonderful women artists, But historically, it's harder finding works that survive by women artists, although there were many of them.
Mm-hmm.
This is a painting that we recently acquired for the Legion of Honor, which is by a French artist called Marie-Guillemine Benoit, who was the first woman to have a history painting displayed at the French Academy in the early 1790s. And it was this piece, it was this mythological subject of Psyche taking leave of her parents, thinking that she's going to be sacrificed. So it's an image of heroic sacrifice, and as a rare surviving piece by a woman artist. So this is the kind of the historical work that we're doing. And then I think if we go one forward in the slides, here we see on a very different front. This is the courtyard at the Legion of Honor, with an installation by the Kenyan artist Wangechi Mutu. There were these large, our courtyard is dominated by this, in the middle, this big bronze by Rodin, the famous sculpture of the thinker, which it almost epitomizes Western philosophy, Western art. It's a naked, athletic male figure, deep in thought. Says it all in a way. And what Wangechi Mutu did was to create, a theme in her art is that because humanity comes out of Africa, it's logical to assume that the mythologies, the oldest mythologies come out of Africa too. But to a large extent, they have been lost, overlaid by Western Mediterranean-centric narratives and mythologies. So in her work, she creates these fantasies, these fictional African god heroes, female goddesses. And so we see two of these sort of godlike figures approaching the entrance to the museum, while in the foreground you have these prone figures cast in bronze who emblemize the nameless, the victims of colonialism. And within the galleries, you had further sculptures that were these sort of presences who kind of contrasted with and in a sense question the male narratives of Western art. I mean, you see here this wonderful figure outstretched, humanoid, but also as if from the depths of the oceans, naked, possibly with a sort of skeletal structure. Behind her, a classical Baroque French painting of a naked woman being presented for our for a male gaze. So I think we're having some, with interventions like this, it's what we're doing is we're for the audience, we're creating contrasts, we're asking questions. They're both serious, but there can also be a light-hearted element to it as well.
Yeah, in India as well, we are struggling with this dilemma because we have inherited the colonial art canon that interpreted our cultural history from a Western perspective, and we are having to rewrite those narratives to reflect our own cultural realities. So I think FAMS have also introduced a new position, the Director of Interpretation, and has that helped sort of change the narratives that you're building? I can see it has from the examples that you've actually drawn out here. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, we've created a number of new roles where, as we seek to diversify our staff, both at the kind of entry level, we're creating roles where we can bring a more diverse staff, but we've also created some senior positions to kind of further this process. One of which is this director of interpretation, and this has been I'm very pleased with the way this is going. I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, we're going to do an exhibition next spring of the work of Kehinde Wiley, whose latest body of work, I don't have a slide of this, but his latest body of work is a series of bronzes that were made during COVID after the murder of George Floyd, that are meditations on the suffering and loss of life of people of color, to police violence especially, and other such things. And these bronzes are inspired in part by classical models, ancient Roman sculptures, or paintings of more recent times that show fallen heroes. But rather than showing the white heroes, these are these young Black men and women who are shown in these, sometimes they're falling asleep, they could be dead, but these sculptures are very beautiful, at the same time very unsettling. And they were first displayed in Venice at the Biennale last spring. And so we've decided to bring this exhibition to San Francisco. And my initial assumption had been we would put them in the main hall. And Abram Jackson, our director of interpretation, working with others, said, no, we can't do this. These objects, this is not just art. These are deeply triggering, deeply disturbing images. So we can't just put them out in the public space where people will come across them without any preparation. We must put them into sort of designated galleries where anyone who sees them will be fully prepared in advance. So it's it's just one example, but it's just like what Abram is doing in this role is it's like a check. It's like constantly making us bring a new level of sensitivity to what we're showing, the way we're describing it. And that's just one example, but I think it gives an idea of how impactful even such a simple check can be on the way we think about these things.
Absolutely. Okay, I think it's time to move away from this somber tone to something that we have enjoy on the director's cut, which is for our guest to walk us through 5 works in the collection that speak to you at a very personal level, something that resonates with you.
Okay, well, I think we've got a few slides lined up. I think the first one does, in fact, still carry on this theme of, rethinking. So here we are. This is the De Young Museum, which was, the De Young was founded in 1895 in Golden Gate Park, but the building that had developed over the decades was damaged in 1989 by an earthquake. And so after that, the decision was made ultimately to tear down the old building and to build a new building. And this is the new building designed by the Swiss architects Herzog and de Meuron. So it is this, almost looks like a kind of a spaceship in Golden Gate Park. It's where, as you said at the beginning, it's where we have our collections of African and Oceanic art, our American collection, a big Mesoamerican, pre-Hispanic collection. And I think maybe the first piece we have is a beautiful, yes, it's this beautiful feather quilt, feather tunic, made about 1,500 years ago in the region of what is today southern Peru, the very dry coastal area. And it's made by the Nazca people, for whom feathers, colored feathers, were one of the most precious forms of ornament beyond gold and jewels. These tiny feathers were carried from the jungles on the eastern, harvested from parrots and other exotic birds on the eastern slopes of the Andes, and carried huge distances, and then made into artifacts. And in this particular case, this gown, which would have been the central rectangle, is actually where the head would have been, and it would have folded on the person on either side of the person's body along that line that runs across the center. And this is millions of tiny feathers stitched one by one into a cotton cloth. So this would have been, you can imagine this shimmering in the light, or or the firelight, with gold adornments. It would have been
bird of paradise. Yeah,
bird of paradise, something godly. So this is really just a reminder of these rich non-Western collections that we hold. I think the next object I have brings us, looks like a very simple, down everyday pot, but there is a story behind this. This is one of a series of jars made by an enslaved man called David, and we've subsequently been identified as a man called David Drake, in South Carolina, in an area called Edgefield. And what was remarkable about Dave the Potter was that at a time when enslaved people were not allowed to write and to read, he wrote his name, or he wrote short poems on some of the ceramics he made. These were made as storage jars. In this case, you may be just able to see there's an inscription here in the ceramic. It says catenation, which is Latin for enchained. And this was made, in fact, at a time when there were laws against enslaved people writing. So he's something of an anomaly. A number of these survive. In fact, there's an exhibition of jars like this now at the Metropolitan in New York. This is a piece we bought about 1.5 years ago. And if we go to the next slide, we've installed this in the gallery where we have American paintings from the Civil War era. So from a period when almost all the art that survives is by white artists, very often heroizing political figures of the time, or painting idyllic scenes of landscape and so on. By placing this jar in the center of this gallery, it's a stark reminder of the history that is not being told. And that's, this is going back to what we were talking about earlier, trying to tell these fuller narratives.
Yeah.
I think the next slide we have this is a bit of a cheat because it's not one work. It's these, I think there are 3 sculptures here from a larger series of about 20. When you visit the De Young, we have this lookout tower, and the base, the room you go through when you go up the tower, is hung with these beautiful wire sculptures that look like, almost like kind of deep sea forms of coral or jellyfish floating in this concrete space. And they're made by a sculptor called Ruth Asawa, who, Japanese American, like I think 120,000 Japanese Americans she and her family were interned during the Second World War. But when the war finished and they were released, she went on, she'd drawn in the internment camp. She went on and became a professional artist. And inspired by basket weaving that she had seen going on in Mexico, much of her mature oeuvre is made up of these metal crocheted amorphic sculptures. Yes, beautiful. That's a nice detail.
Exquisite, yeah.
And we have, one of the things we do to distinguish our museum from, an East Coast or a Central American museum is we're very mindfully collecting art by artists from the Bay Area. Ruth Asawa, Wayne Thiebaud, Diebenkorn, and other greats like that. So when you come to our galleries, you're going to see a slightly distinct narrative to what you'd see if you go to the Metropolitan or to Boston or to Philadelphia, with this emphasis on Californian artists.
Yeah.
Now, I think if we go on, we go to, so here we have a nice aerial shot of the Legion of Honor. The Legion was opened in 1924. It is a scale replica of a palace in Paris called the Palais de Sarmes, which is right by the Musée d'Orsay. And it was commissioned and built by a philanthropist, a San Francisco philanthropist called Alma Bretval de Spreckels, who loved France. She loved Rodin, so hence the decision to create a building that was a replica of this Paris building. And this is where we have our antiquities and European collections. And if we go forward one, I think we have a big collection of decorative arts, tapestries and ceramics and porcelain and furniture. This is a 15th century tapestry showing peasants hunting for rabbits. They're putting ferrets down the rabbit holes and chasing out the poor rabbits that get caught in the nets. It's the sort of idyllic country scene that was portrayed in tapestries that would have been hung in the sort of the bedchambers and the private rooms of the nobility of the day, while in the public rooms they would have had grand histories and religious subjects, but these more genre scenes were considered more appropriate for more private rooms. And then I think we have this is a beautiful 18th century painting by Canaletto that we actually purchased literally a month ago. And it came from a sale of a family called Gettys, Gordon Getty and Anne Getty in San Francisco. And this was the kind of the jewel in the crown of that collection. It was painted in the mid-18th century by Canaletto, who's the great landscape painter of the 18th century, great Italian landscape painter. And it depicts the Grand Canal in Venice, looking south towards Santa Maria della Salute, which was built as a memorial after a very bad outbreak of the plague in Venice, which had killed something like 50,000 people. This church was built to commemorate the end of that plague. And in a way, it's a kind of fitting symbol for us as we emerge from the COVID plague. But it's a beautiful painting that for us, we're always looking to build our collections. And this is, we had no Canaletto. This is a beautiful addition to our collection of European paintings. So a very quick overview of what is a, you can't really show a global collection of 5 pieces, but maybe that gives a slight sense of range.
But after seeing that, the tapestry you showed us on rabbit hunting, you have a deep interest in learning in tapestries, European tapestries and textiles, and you spent 14 years as a curator and scholar. And besides doing a host of other things, you turned the spotlight on the major role of tapestry in European art and propaganda. So tell us, what is it about tapestries that moves you?
I think that there are really 2 things. First, I mean, they're in a way they're woven paintings, but along with the beauty of the image, you have the richness and the character of the materials. So I find them, when I began to study them and really look at them, there was a beauty to them that really struck me, that I think was overlooked by so many other people. We're trained to look at paintings and people walk past the tapestries. So that was a discovery for me. The other big discovery was that, art history until quite recently taught us that what mattered was painting and sculpture and architecture. And as a student, what I realized as I kind of went into the archives and began to look at the history was that in Europe, from the Middle Ages really until the 18th century, the great patrons of the day valued tapestry more highly than painting. So there was a kind of, it was the realized art history is wrong. And I felt I realized that, I had a role to kind of try and recalibrate this. And it was, I think in a way that's been core to my work, both as a curator and then as director, that, we inherit a canon. Many very intelligent people have contributed to building it, but it's only as good as the context in which it was created. Everything is always, so many things need to be corrected, changed. And so as director now, and coming back to what we were talking about earlier, in a way, I feel that the work I'm now leading with all of my staff, trying to recalibrate the canon, it almost grows out of that. For me, it comes from the same place. It's realizing that, the canon is only as it needs to be challenged all the time.
Absolutely. Well, talking about canons, it also leads me to this the subject of restitution. Perhaps President Macron and the Saint-Savoy report caused the narrative to shift quite dramatically, where museums are actually considering the question of whether they should be returning artworks that were taken through exploitative means or colonial action from communities who owned them. Tom, you have supported the repatriation of works, and that is unusual for large museums who have encyclopedia collections, as did the Met. You want to share your thoughts?
Yes, I mean, I think that during the, you've got 2 waves of colonialism, in a sense. You've got the European colonialism of the 19th century, when Britain, France, Germany, Italy took large numbers of objects from non-European countries that they ruled or that they had engagement with. Then you've got a second wave of the colonialism of the dollar, when in the 20th century, Americans were spending very large sums of money to acquire works of art from around the world. And sometimes it was licit and sometimes it was illicit. And after the Second World War, especially, there was a huge explosion in illegal excavations of antiquities. And I think that all came to a head in the late 20th century after there was the 1970 UNESCO treaty that sought to stop illegal excavations and illegal trade. But it took really a couple of decades before that caught up, and the museum industry really made efforts to change its ways. And I think I became director at the Met in the wake of that the Met itself had to return a number of objects that had been found to have been illegally removed. And I became director at a time when there was a kind of new effort at transparency. And so in my role at the Met, we did return a number of objects that, when evidence came forward that they had been illicitly excavated or traded. But I think there is this bigger question now, this bigger reckoning going on, and the report that the French, the Macron Commission, really report, exactly. And I think that's, there's now this much larger discussion going on around certain hot points like the Benin bronzes, and a readiness to begin to rethink where things belong. And I don't know the answer, but I do think that the notion that the encyclopedic museums of the West somehow have a right to hold these objects in perpetuity, because all the excuses that have been given, that more people see them, they make them available. I think in an age of travel and digital knowledge, many of those arguments are revealed as the sort of paper thin rhetoric, and that if museums want to be truly enlightened, then they may have played a role for decades, if not centuries, of looking after these objects. But a point comes where the colonial origins of those collections is problematic, and that they do need to consider where the future of those objects appropriately lies. So I hope that we will enter a period of much more flexible discussion of long-term loans, and in some cases of the return of major objects.
Yeah. I can see a question here, so let's take one. It says, thanks so much. This was a very engaging talk, but what do you think is important for a museum to think about while collecting art today?
Well, it depends on the circumstances and wealth of the museum, I suppose, as to what they can acquire, because the prices, when you watch the prices fetched by the Paul Allen sale last week, these prices are way beyond the means of any museum. I think, you want to start with your local artists. It's, artists we live in a world of extraordinary change and development, and sadly of polarization and combat. And I think that contemporary artists are, their work helps us think about these issues, sometimes explicitly, sometimes in a more abstract way. And if you work with local artists who haven't yet made, crazy prices in the auction houses, you can at least start collecting there. And you want to think about your location, where you are, you know, what stories you can tell to the people, who are you serving, and what stories you tell to those to your local visitors. I think that's the core of any strong museum.
You spoke about a world that's polarized and combative today. Is there any figure that you find in today's world who's inspirational, who's inspired you, and who has made a difference to the community or the people that they live with?
Well, I'd pick a couple.
Okay.
President Obama and his wife, Michelle,
yeah.
who have, to me, embody thoughtfulness and wisdom and elegance and kindness. And I think they're wonderful role models.
Absolutely. They have been wonderful, and I think we all miss them. But maybe one last question about exhibitions, because that's really at the core of what museums do. And are we seeing the end of the blockbuster exhibitions that most major museums built their programming around? Because I know you have been responsible for several critically acclaimed exhibitions, both at the Met and at FAMSF. Picasso at the Met, Alexander McQueen, Warhol, and in SF you did Soul of a Nation, Frida Kahlo. But these exhibitions require huge amounts of money and resources to move artworks from various locations across the globe. So as you had answered in your question, are museums now also exploring issues, collections, and artists closer home that connect with their communities, especially post-pandemic?
I think that there was back in the 1970s and the 1980s was really the kind of the decades of the blockbuster, and that into the early 2000s, where museums were organizing very ambitious exhibitions in a way that now is financially prohibitive. The high valuation, the high insurance costs of organizing these big exhibitions, the demand on these objects is making it harder and harder. But at the same time, I hope that they will continue to some extent, because it's through these big ambitious exhibitions that we're able to introduce major movements to new audiences, and to kind of carry on this dialogue. I remember when I was at the Met, I would say to a curator, can't we do a survey exhibition of this subject or that subject?
Mm-hmm.
And they would say, no, we can't do that because that was done in Vienna in 1972. I said, but that was 40 years ago, 45 years ago. So I think there's we have to think about our audiences, and we do have a responsibility to kind of not just give them the familiar, the popular, the big 10, 15 names, but we also want to do these ambitious shows that bring new people forward. And we've just had an exhibition of this fabulous Chinese couturier called Guo Pei. I think we might have a slide of her work. She is known in China as China's leading couturier, but she's almost unknown in the West, or she's not a household name. And but she's revived traditions of embroidery and iconography from the Qing dynasty that she combines with a kind of postmodern sensibility. She draws inspiration from all sorts of different sources. And we have this exhibition installed at the Legion of Honor. And it's been an absolute blow-away success, partly because of the power of social media. People have been taking photographs of these beautiful dresses and beautiful accoutrements. And it's really generated the largest audience we've had at the Legion of Honor for many years. So it's the kind of blockbuster that I like, where it's a really meaningful subject. It's new material, but it catches people's excitement and fantasy.
We are now at the end of the hour, and it's been a pleasure talking to you, Tom. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us here. And as a new museum, there's so much that we have now to learn from all of you who've been in this space for so many years. So I hope we will continue this relationship, this conversation, and this engagement between our museums. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and best of wishes for your opening. And thank you very much for inviting me to take part, and to you and to your colleagues for setting this up. And again, I apologize for the technical complexities that brought me in at the last minute this morning.